Hi, everybody. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Now that we are a few weeks out from the election, I wanted to make a quick video with some of my thoughts on it. Especially now that we've had a few weeks since the election, we have most of the results, pretty much know how everything turned out, and had a little bit of time to have some perspective, so we're not trying to make a judgment immediately after the election. And there's been a number of things that I've been thinking about that just don't add up for me. And I'll explain kind of what I mean. They don't add up as far as what it seems to me what happened or how we should interpret what happened, and kind of the conventional wisdom or the media narratives we're hearing. So, what is the big narrative, or what are the big narratives that we've heard over the past few weeks? For the Democrats, it's been kind of a victory lap. If you would just paid attention to the media, in fact, and you didn't really look at the results, you might think that Democrats won everything, that they took the House and the Senate and just swept everything in pretty large margins. And so I want to explain a little bit why that is, and why I think the reaction that it's a big win. I'm not going to say that it was a totally bad night, because that's not true either. But the idea that this was a sweeping victory for Democrats is just that's just not borne out. And let's talk about why this is the narrative. So to me, there's a couple reasons. Well, the main reason is that the Democrats were expected to lose big. So we heard all this talk of a red wave. And if you go back and listen to my interview with Jeremy Zogby just before the election, we talked about this, and both of us came to the conclusion that a lot of people were jumping to conclusions about what might happen. I said I wouldn't be surprised if the Republicans had a successful night, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it was very close, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Democrats had a slight advantage at the end. I didn't think there would be really sweeping victories for the Democrats, but it pretty much fell in kind of the margin of what I expected. But why were so many people expecting a red wave? So there's a couple reasons for this. One, the Republicans kind of made a big push the last few weeks to push this idea. And I think it was an attempt to drive Democratic turnout down, just to get Democrats or people who might vote for Democrats just to think their vote doesn't count and there's no point in coming out. That doesn't seem to have worked for the most part. The other reason, though, that there was this idea ahead of time about a red wave is this idea that the party in power, so the party that holds the White House in the midterm election, usually suffers big defeats. So they usually lose quite bad, a number of seats. And this was just repeated over and over again, like this is just like it's a law of political nature. So I want to show you something here, and I'm going to show you something and show you that that's not necessarily true. That's not always the case. So I'm going to be sharing some information here, some numbers and graphics. So if you happen to be listening to this on the podcast, you might want to watch it on the YouTube channel where you can see a lot of these things. So what I have brought up here is this is the 1934 U.S. House of Representatives election. So this was a midterm election that happened in 1934 during FDR's first term. So He was elected president in 1932, and so he had his first midterm election in 1934. Now, according to all of the conventional wisdom that we've heard ad nauseum, he should have lost in this midterm big time, because that's what we've been told over, right? Presidents always lose their midterm elections during their first term. So let's see exactly what happened here. This is the House. Democrats carried almost 54% of the popular vote, while Republicans only got 41%. So that is a 13-point difference, and the Democrats won 322 seats to Republicans at 103. That is a landslide by any measure. So, wait a second. This doesn't match what we've been told. Let's go and look at the Senate the same year. So this is the Senate. So let's look at what happened in the Senate. Democrats gained 9 seats. So they ended up in the end with 69 Senate seats to the Republicans' 25. Not exactly a bad night. So in both the House and the Senate, in 1934, apparently being a first-term president didn't really hinder much in their midterm results. And I just remind everybody that the context that the 1934 elections took place in, this was in the Great Depression. So this was a time of real instability just after the stock market crash, unemployment, rising unrest, labor unrest, a lot of poverty in the country. And I should also say, similar to the time that we have now, a kind of a rising authoritarian, I would say fascist movement in the United States. Not nearly as strong as what we eventually saw in Europe, of course, but people forget that there was that kind of movement here in America at the time. We just responded differently to it, and we had a better result because of it. But it was there. So you can't say, well, this is the best that we can do in a situation because we're facing such a threat. The best we can do is get to a stalemate. No. What FDR did was he instituted programs and policies that not only helped to alleviate what was going on, but were very popular and led to electoral success, and essentially fought back the authoritarian movement in the United States at the time. So this is possible. This is a direct counterexample, or a counterexample to this claim that it's not possible to win the midterms in your first term. So you might think, well, this is just 1 year. You're cherry picking here. So let me show you another year. So in 1962, JFK was in the middle of his first term. And so let's see how they did here. Now, one difference between this year and the midterms that we just had is that the Democrats had a really big majority going into it. So, I mean, there wasn't as much room to pick up, but they did lose 4 seats, and the Republicans gained 1, it says here. But the final result was that they still held 258 seats to the Republicans' 176, and they won the popular vote by 5 percentage points, more than 5 percentage points here. You can see the map there. So, again, maybe not a great victory in the sense of gaining a bunch of seats, but when you already hold a huge majority and you're able to hold it, except for maybe a couple seats, that's a pretty good night. And it's certainly not what happened a few weeks ago when you held a slight majority and you lost that slight majority. That's very different. Now, in the Senate, the same year, Also, the Democrats had a very large majority in the Senate, and they actually gained seats. They gained 4 seats in the Senate, leaving them with 68 to 32. So overall, a good night. So there's 2 examples that it is possible to buck this so-called law of the midterms that every presidential administration loses a ton of seats in the midterm. It is true that in the past few decades that has been more the pattern, but even there, it's not an ironclad rule. For instance, in 2002, Bush did not lose that many seats. So you can only maybe interpret this as a huge victory if your expectations are set that you're expecting huge losses. If you're expecting enormous losses, then when you basically draw, when you basically get to a stalemate, then you might interpret that as an enormous victory. But I'm just not sure that's the case. There's something else I want to bring up here about the results from the House specifically, so let me show you that. So this is the 2022 National House Vote Tracker from Cook Political Report. Basically what they do here is they just total all of the votes cast for the House of Representatives and just give you the total in terms of Democrats and Republicans. These do not add up to 100% because there's candidates who are not Democrats or Republicans. So what were the results? First of all, the first thing that jumped out to me here is the total is only 107 million. Now, normally that you wouldn't say only. That would be a good turnout. But I had been hearing things like, oh, we're going to see 120 million people or maybe more come out. It's going to match or exceed what we saw in the last midterms. And it doesn't seem like that's happened. So enthusiasm's not quite as high, maybe on both sides as we thought. But the breakdown then, about 54.3 million for Republicans and 51.1 for Democrats. So that's 50.7% to 47.8%. That is nearly 3 full percentage points. Yeah, this is not, I don't know how you interpret this as a victory when you lose by 3 percentage points and you lose control of the House. Let me show you the map here. And this gets into something else that I noticed. When I looked at this map and other maps of the result, and I noticed this pattern. What's another conventional thinking that we've heard a lot? We're often told, well, there are no strict geographic divisions that you can make, like you could during the 1860s or something, or 1850s. There's no north and south. So I've often heard people say things like, it's all mixed up. Definitely there are blue states and there are red states. That's for certain. But inside of red states, there are always blue areas and red states. There are always red areas and blue states and so on. And, even within various, any particular city or region, you're always going to find a mix of red and blue or conservative and liberal. And that's true to an extent. But I think we can see some patterns here. And so what I did was I looked at the results by congressional district, and I just broke the country into 3 pieces. And you could say, well, it's arbitrary to break them into pieces to make a certain point because you can choose the pieces to make whatever point you want. For instance, I could break the country into all the blue districts and then all the red districts and say, look, we're totally divided because the blue districts vote 100% for Democrats and the red 100% for Republicans. That wouldn't make any sense because those districts don't fit a nice geographical pattern. But the divisions that, the pieces that I chose do have this kind of geographic and cultural and political kind of distinct pattern behind them. And I think it justifies grouping in this way. So what I did was I took 3 groups. The first was just California, Oregon, and Washington. And so I called that the West Coast. So just include all the voters in those 3 states, all the congressional districts in those 3 states. So we're looking at the House here. And then I looked at the East Coast, and if you look over here at the East, notice it's all blue there up in the Northeast, all the way from Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, all the way down to pretty much New Jersey has a couple red districts, and then Maryland and Delaware also as well. But it's pretty much blue. It's like 90% or more blue districts there, and so you know that what's going to correlate with these blue districts is really going to be that kind of megalopolis region. So this is called the Acela corridor, and it goes all the way from I guess Boston in the north, all the way down to like Washington D.C. in the south. But I've seen it even go. Some people say it even stretches into New Hampshire and maybe even Maine a bit if you're really stretching it. And some people have it go down to various parts of Virginia. But what I did was I included several of these states here, and then I included the districts of New York for New York City, because there's a huge difference between New York City and upstate New York. And I included just the handful of districts for Philadelphia, the Philadelphia metro area, which is much different than Western Pennsylvania. They're, as far as I can tell, they're totally different politically and culturally in a lot of ways. And then I included one district in Virginia, which is right next to Washington, D.C. So you could say, well, you're really cherry picking your districts there. But if you were to go to a map and actually look at these particular districts, you would see they're all contiguous. So they're all connected, and they really have a kind of a common geographic and political structure to them. They're all connected in one of these large, again, megalopolis. So they're all one contiguous, highly urbanized area. And there's just a lot of connections. The name Acela Corridor itself comes from the Amtrak train that runs through it. So I think it's okay to group this way. California, Oregon, Washington, I think makes sense to group them that way. Certainly California by itself, it's a state with its own identity and everything. And I think it's pretty reasonable to include Oregon and Washington with California because there are a lot of connections between them. I lived in Oregon for 2 years. I went to school there for 2 years. I've known friends who lived, family friends who lived in Oregon. I visited Oregon a lot. Even been up to Washington, been to Seattle, taken vacations up there. So Californians are pretty familiar with Oregon and Washington. There's a lot of connections with family and friends and institutions and education and all sorts of things. It's they are different states and they're slightly different culture, of course, and that kind of thing. But it's much more familiar than anything east of the Rockies or even the East Coast. And then as far as I said, the Acela Corridor, that really makes sense because that's pretty well-known region that's connected and interrelated in a variety of ways, even though it spans many, many states. So I think it makes sense to have these two groups. And then everything else, I called it the Middle America. So the West Coast, Acela Corridor on the east, and then everything else in the Middle America. And I want to show you the results. I tallied up a number of different things. I tallied up the House results, the Senate results, and then I did something interesting, I think, that I haven't seen anybody do. I assigned the Electoral College votes to the states by their House popular vote total. So I looked up for each state who won the popular vote in that state in the congressional, the House election, and then use that as if it were a presidential election and assign the electoral votes and say, well, this is how a presidential election would have gone, more or less, according to how the House election went. So let's take a look at that. So here's the table that I made up. So if you're listening, again, you have to watch the video to see the numbers here. So I have on the right is just the total for the US. And then in the first three columns, I have West Coast, Middle America, Acela Corridor. And again, it lists exactly what's included in this. The West Coast, just 3 states, California, Oregon, Washington. Acela Corridor. So this is Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Washington, D.C., because they have congressional, well, they have representation in the Congress, even though they don't vote. And they also are included in the Electoral College, so I included them. And then New York, districts 1 through 16, the first 16 districts, which is essentially New York City. Everything not upstate. Pennsylvania, the first 6 districts, 1 through 6, which is the Philly metro area. And then the 8th district of Virginia, which is the one that's just adjacent to Washington, D.C. I think it has Alexandria and Arlington. Those districts are pretty much what most people would consider to be constituting this Acela Corridor, which is this kind of distinct. It's the largest megalopolis in the country, and it's one of the largest in the world. It's got like 50 million people plus. Then I actually did a number of measurements for these. So I had to, from a number of different sources, I pretty much was able to get, I think, accurate numbers for this. There's a lot of similarities between the West Coast and the Acela Corridor as far as the numbers that come out. California, Oregon, Washington I got 51.2 million. This was by, I guess, July 2021 numbers. 51.2 on the West Coast, 48.4 in Acela. So that's very comparable. They each have roughly 15% of the population, leaving, for Middle America, the rest, 70%. So Middle America is the vast majority of the country. The middle, in between these two regions on the coast, have 232 million, which is much more than the West Coast and the Acela Corridor combined. Now, there's 435 House seats. The West Coast, in 2022, after the redistricting, has 68 seats. Acela Corridor has 65, leaving 302 in the middle. And again, this roughly matches up with the population. It says 15, 15, 70. So that's almost exactly 15% of the House seats for each of those, and then 70% in the middle. Now, there's a distinction with the Senate because obviously California is such a huge state. There's going to be less senators, only 6 senators on the West, 22 on the East, and then 72 remaining in the middle. And then the Electoral College votes, again, it's more in line, but slightly less on the West because California, 74 electoral votes in the West, 89 in the Acela Corridor, leaving the 375 in the middle. And of course, there's 538 total. That's why the website is called 538, because there's 538 electoral votes. Okay, so let's look at the results here. Scroll down. How did the popular vote break down? Well, again, so if you go to, and this is based on a few days ago, so this isn't completely up to date time of recording, but you can see there in the US total, about the 3 percentage point difference, 54.2 to 50.9 million, which you would say, well, that's really close. I mean, they did lose, and they lost by a few percentage points, but it's not a total wipeout. It's not like a landslide. But then you look at the breakdown between these three groups that I've made, these geographically, culturally, politically, socially kind of distinct areas of the country. And again, middle America has a lot of differences in it. I just threw everything else into there. So you could even maybe break down that into 2 or 3. But just looking at just these 2 and then everything else, the West Coast, the Democrats won by 23 percentage points, 61.5 to 38.5%. That's a landslide. That's a repudiation of Donald Trump. That's a repudiation of Trumpism and the Republican Party. To me, that's a repudiation of fascism. 9.4 million to 5.9 million. Then look at Acela Corridor, almost identical. 9.5 million to 5.8, 62% to 38%. So slightly more, 24% win. So huge wins. A strong repudiation of the right-wing Republicans, Trumpism, MAGA, whatever you want to call it. Just a really big defeat. And then look at the middle of the country, just the 70% in the middle of America. Republicans won by 14 percentage points, 57% to 43%. 14 percentage points. This is why I think when you, especially with the effect of the bubbles in social media, this is why so many people in the middle of the country just are in disbelief about why Republicans didn't have a landslide, and why they don't understand how Democrats could have, how Biden could have won, how Democrats could do even as well as they do. Because in their part of the country, for the most part, everyone they know, the districts around them, culturally, geographically, politically around them, the Republicans are winning. And it's not even close, 14%. The middle of America is Trump America. You can see it. It's right there in the numbers. So it's very believable then to see why people think the election was stolen, or why they would be susceptible to that. The same reason that people in California, Oregon, and Washington, and on the East Coast and in the Northeast couldn't believe that Trump would win, because they don't know anybody that really votes for Trump, because they don't live in the middle of the country. Let's look at the House results. The West Coast, 52 to 16. So that's 36 seat advantage. And on the East, 55 to 10. I mean, those are not just super majorities, they're super majorities. On the West, more than 75%. And look at that, on the East, more than 84% of the seats, the House seats, were won by Democrats in the Acela Corridor. And look in the middle of the country, Republicans won 196 to 106. Those are the type of numbers they were saying was the red wave. So this is what I'm saying. They said there was going to be a red wave. And what we ended up getting was a stalemate. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom that's being said now. But what I see is there was a red wave, but there was also a blue wave. It's just that the red wave happened in the middle of the country, and the blue wave happened on the coasts. And the blue wave was so strong on the coasts. I mean, these are overwhelming. I mean, the numbers on the 2 coasts are overwhelming, even compared to the middle of the country for Republicans. They're so overwhelming on the coasts that it appears like it's a stalemate nationally. But if you just look in the middle of the country, there was a red wave. They won by 14 percentage points, and they took almost 2/3 of the seats in the House. Look at the Senate. Of course, the West gets all 6 seats, so it's really the East that we're looking at. In the Acela Corridor, 21 to 1. They only don't hold 1 seat. So this includes previous seats. I think it's, what is it, Maine? Who's the Maine senator? I'm blanking on her name right now. Susan Collins, I think, is the one Republican in Maine. The other 21 are Democrats. So that's 100% on the West Coast and 95.5% of the Senate seats on the East. And then look in the middle of the country. I split up Georgia because we don't know how that's going to go so far. 67%. So basically, in the middle of the country, the Republicans hold a supermajority, 2/3 of the Senate seats. So that's more than a filibuster-proof majority. That would be close to 2/3. And then this is super interesting. The Electoral College. So what would the Electoral College result have been? I'll show you a map of this in a second. If you assign the states by Electoral College vote according to their House result in 2022, the Republicans would have won 297 to 241. That's not really that close. You have to flip a few, at least two, probably 3, 4, or 5 states, depending on their size there, to overcome that. So it looks like if this was a presidential election, the Republicans would have won 297 to 241. But then look at the breakdown in these 3 parts of the country. On the West Coast, of course, it's just the 3 states. They didn't get any electoral votes, so 74 to 0. But even on the East Coast, in the Acela corridor, they won every single state. And so what I did here was I kind of, for New York and Pennsylvania, I kind of split them according to the number of districts. So the number of districts, like the 16 New York districts, I counted that in the electoral count, and then I split the senators 1 each for New York and Philadelphia. Again, I'm cutting New York and Pennsylvania kind of in half, but I think that makes sense for a lot of reasons because there's 2 very different parts of those states. So when you do that, 89 to 0. Okay, as far as the electoral vote. And then in the middle of the country, 297, of course, and then to 78. So what this is saying is that the number of electoral votes that the Democrats are getting in the middle of the country is not even more than what they're getting on the West Coast or the East Coast by themselves, individually. So they're barely getting more electoral votes in the middle of the country than they are in just the 3 states on the West. And they're getting less than that many electoral votes than in the Acela corridor, which is only 15% of the country. So what we see is all of the support for the Democrats is basically coming from these 2 parts of the country, these 2 coasts. And there's a huge red middle, Republican middle, with a few notable exceptions. Again, everybody's going to say you're ignoring some. Yes, there's Chicago. There's a few metro areas. There's Colorado and New Mexico, which are fairly blue. But those are small parts of America, and they're more the exception to the rule. Even if you look at kind of the more populated parts, like the Rust Belt, that's a megalopolis. That's a huge urban area there that's interconnected. And a lot of those states barely went for the Republicans. Very close. Not so. Just you can't say it's just because the urban areas are all going for Democrats. Like if it's urban, it's Democrat. A lot of these urban areas in the middle of the country are split. They're not landslides for the Democrats. So again, let me show you the map for the electoral vote. I think this is really key to understand that if this had been a presidential election, we would have a Republican president right now. So what you're looking at right now, I went into, I think it's 538 to win or 270 to win. Anyway, it's this website where you can play around with the different numbers on the Electoral College. And this is the updated one for 2024, 270 to win, yeah. And I just colored the states according to their House popular vote. So you can see here, we talked about the West Coast, all 3 in the West go for the Democrats. And then look at the East Coast here, a huge contiguous block. Maine, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, all that down to Virginia. That's all connected, contiguous, politically, culturally related, interrelated area. And then all that's in between is, okay, you got New Mexico and Colorado. Those are pretty good blue states, but they're not very populated. There's Chicago, so Illinois. But even Chicago, there's the Chicago, and then there's the rest of it is pretty red. Minnesota and Michigan were very close in the House popular vote. Could have easily gone the other way. And you can see the result, 297 for Republicans, 241 to Democrats. So they would have to flip, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, some combination of those, and still hold on to those tenuous seats of Minnesota, Michigan. So going into 2024, I don't feel good about how this might turn out. There was a lot of effort put into this election, and if you just look at it objectively, state by state, I think that it looks like it's hard for Democrats to get to 270. If this is the best they could do, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good to me. We didn't see a lot of political violence. There wasn't a whole lot of election denial and refusing, to accept results and so on. And that's true. I was really worried about that there would be a bunch of violence immediately after. There would be many, many candidates who maybe refused to concede or would really stoke these conspiracy theories. And to be fair, we've seen some of that, especially in the state AZ over there, Arizona. But by and large, not so much as people were expecting. But I want to show you a video. My fear is that people are getting complacent. And my fear is that we might be in kind of the eye of a hurricane, if you can think about what that analogy might mean. So I'm going to show you a video from 2 years ago.
All right, Crystal, what's on your radar?
Well, folks, not sure what happened here this past week, but I am sorely disappointed. I mean, I have been promised a fascist authoritarian coup directed by Vladimir Putin himself for 4 years now, and I'm getting a little impatient waiting to see how it all goes down. In fact, I was told this election wouldn't even happen because Trump would cancel it or at least postpone it indefinitely. I was told that an elaborate plot was being hatched with scary words like disinformation and misinformation and deep fakes to rob poor innocent Joe Biden of his rightful victory. I was informed in no uncertain terms that Attorney General Bill Barr had masterminded a devious plot to confiscate ballot boxes, or that Trump would force the FDA to inject all Democrats with toxic hydroxychloroquine or something. It's hard to see how this, a hastily arranged presser in the parking lot of Four Seasons Landscaping, fits into their evil genius plan. Sure, Trump is launching legal challenges and refusing to concede, but even state media outlet Fox News doesn't really seem to have their heart in the game.
We want every legal vote to be counted, and we want every illegal vote to be...
I just think we have to be very clear. She's charging the other side is welcoming fraud and welcoming illegal voting. Unless she has more details to back that up, I can't in good countenance continue showing you this. I want to make sure that maybe they do have something to back that up. But that's an explosive charge to make, that the other side is effectively rigging and cheating. If she does bring proof of that, of course, we'll take you back. So far, she has started saying right at the outset, welcoming fraud, welcoming illegal voting. Not so fast.
You know, one of the greatest lies of the Trump era was that this dude was remotely up to the task of being some Hitlerian figure. Now here we stand with every network, including Fox News, having called the race for Biden. And how has our orange Mussolini reacted? By doing what he always does, saying a bunch of ridiculous crap, sending out a bunch of stupid tweets, and not a whole heck of a lot else. It turns out that Matt Taibbi was exactly right when he wrote this. The words we see slapped on Trump most often, like fascist and authoritarian, nowhere near describe what he really is, and I don't mean that as a compliment. It's been proven across 4 years that Trump lacks the attention span or ambition required to implement a truly dictatorial regime. He might not have a moral problem with the idea, but 2 minutes into the plan, he'd leave the room, phone in hand, to throw on a robe and watch himself on Fox and Friends over a cheeseburger. There's no constitutional crisis coming with dueling sets of electors, let alone some military-backed coup in which Trump attempts to stay in the White House beyond his term. The latest terrors gripping resistance liberals are rather revealing and frankly just how pathetic they are. We're supposed to be deeply concerned for the future of democracy because Trump fired the former Raytheon lobbyist who was running the Department of Defense. The horrors. And he may fire the former George W. Bush admin guy who's running the FBI. Outrageous. My favorite, though, is that all of their elaborate fascist coup plots have actually collapsed down to this. Some GSA Trump appointees refusing to sign a letter acknowledging Biden's election. Inconceivable. What if they have to wait a week or two before they can decide in earnest whether they're giving Pete Buttigieg VA or UN ambassador? The country hangs in the balance. The people who have stoked the most outrageous fears about Donald Trump have been completely wrong.
Well, that didn't age too well, did it? There's one more fact that I want to point out. This is a data point that I found, and it's kind of lucky that I came across it. So this has to do with the fact that we're hearing a lot about the youth vote, that the youth vote is surging for Democrats, and that's really what allowed them to perform so well during the election. And so when you talk about the youth vote and how well it did for Democrats, maybe we should drill down a little further on that. And it is true the Democrats did win the youth vote by substantial margin, but there are some caveats to that. So let me show you one of those. So what we're looking at here is Edison Research National Election Poll. So this is an exit poll that they conduct for the national youth vote. So this is exit poll data for the 2022 midterms, and they define youth to be 18 to 29-year-olds. And yes, the Democrats won that age group by 28 points, 63 to 35. And here you can see the historical difference. It was pretty close throughout the 90s, even up to 2000, 2002, and then of course, it really started to diverge with the election of Barack Obama and has continued since then in that direction. But I want to look down a little further at what they have here. So if you look at youth vote in key battleground states, this looks like good data. They look and they notice party preference, participation can vote state by state, which is just what I was saying. And looks good in a lot of these states that are not necessarily blue states. Arizona, Senate and governor, they took 76%, 71%. Did well in Georgia, Michigan. Really good in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, some of these swing states. Okay, so that's good. Not so good in North Carolina, only took 52%. Not so good in Florida, only 58%. But then I scrolled around a bit and looked at some other parts of this report. In particular, this one. Now, young voters are not a monolith. Their vote choices vary widely by gender, race, ethnicity, and other factors. And so if you look at the overall numbers, remember, Democrats won 63%. Okay, now let's look at here. If you only look at white youth voters, that drops to 57. Now, that's not a huge drop, but it does show that if you're white, there's an area where there's white young voters, that number is going to drop a bit. So you're going to be not quite as successful. And I also know, although I couldn't find hard data for this, that the Democrats do well among college-educated voters in general. So I'm certain that they do better among college-educated young voters compared to non-college educated. Okay, so that's two things we know specifically about young voters. So the Democrats do better with non-white voters, Hispanic or voters of color, and they do much better with college-educated young voters. But then I noticed this as well. Look at this last little bullet point here. There was a big urban-rural divide in the youth vote. Not only did Democrats' support among young voters drop among young voters from rural areas, they didn't even win them, and it wasn't even close. Young voters from small towns or rural areas backed Republicans 64 to 33%. So think about that. They won 63% overall, but when you look at rural voters, 18 to 29, this is not older. That's the key. This is not, 40-something, 50-something, 65-year-olds. This is 18 to 29-year-olds in rural areas. They only got 33%. Republicans won 2/3 of those voters. So that means, and this is something I haven't seen many people pick up on, this big narrative about the youth vote being something that's going to be very good for the Democrats in the future. They're not taking into account that the youth vote is not uniform, that the Democrat vote for the youth, their voters that are voting for them are not uniformly distributed around the country. They're concentrated in different parts of the country. And where are these young Democratic voters coming from? Well, we just went over three things. We know that the youth that vote for Democrats, they're much more likely to vote Democrat if they are, if they're non-white, college educated, and or from urban or suburban areas. Now think about what areas of the country have that. What parts of the country are dominated by urban and suburban voters, by non-white voters, and by voters who are college educated. And that's mostly the coasts where those are concentrated. Not entirely, but a lot. The rural areas make up, if I remember, about 20% of the country, 20% of the population of the country. Suburban, I think, is about 50%, and then urban is 30%. So 20% is still a pretty substantial part of the population. So let's go back to, I'm going to go back to one of these maps. And actually, I'm going to show you a map showing the distribution of rural and urban areas. So this is a map, so data from 2017, showing a distribution, what percentage of the population lives in rural areas. So the lighter the shading, the more urban the population is, and the darker the shading, the more rural. So you can see here, where are the urban areas? Well, it's along the coast. You got California, a bit of Oregon and Washington. There's also Nevada, Arizona, Utah here. But other than that, it's primarily up here, New York, the Acela corridor that we were talking about. Of course, there's Chicago, so that makes Illinois lighter shade. And Florida, interesting enough, Florida's a very urban area, but in a lot of ways, Florida ends up being an exception to a lot of rules, as we saw this election. But most of the middle of the country, just take a look at the middle of the country, extending, from Idaho down through, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, especially the Midwest, the Rust Belt, the South. Those are the more rural areas of the country. In fact, a lot of these states have upwards of 30, 35, 40, maybe even 50% or more rural population, which means they're not getting those young Democratic votes. Now, does that mean that they're losing the youth vote in these areas? No, they're probably still winning it. And if you look at the actual state by state, I think in most of these states, the Democrats still were winning 18 to 29-year-olds, but the margins were much smaller. And that's the point I want to get at, is Democrats need to be racking up these margins with the youth vote in order to be competitive in a lot of these states. Now, they were able to do it this cycle, but they're going to have to continue to do it. And my fear is that they're going to be complacent and they're going to buy into this idea that I have heard, honestly, my entire life. since 1992. I heard since Bill Clinton. I've heard this: demographics are destiny. Young people, the population's just becoming more diverse, and the young people are, don't like the Republican Party and blah blah blah. And if we just sit back and do nothing, they're just going to vote for us. I heard that during Bill Clinton's term, and then certainly heard it after Barack Obama was elected in 2008. It's just like, this is over. The Republican Party's dead. They're never coming back, because the demographics are just against them. So I've been hearing this for a long time, and so it's a matter of remembering that the presidency is not determined by the national popular vote. It's the Electoral College. It's a series of state contests. And even the House is not really a popular vote. It's a series of contests in these districts that have been gerrymandered. And with what I said about the youth vote, again, the Democratic youth vote is primarily concentrated on the West Coast and then this Acela corridor. A few exceptions. Of course, there's Chicago. There's a few of the smaller urban, suburban areas in the middle of the country. But if you notice, even in the Rust Belt, they're not quite as urban there. So there's a path there. If they're not racking up these margins, they're looking at the overall youth vote nationally, and they're not realizing the margins are smaller in the middle of the country, and they're counting on that. There's a path to make that up. The Republicans can make that up in a lot of these states, and they still have a path to narrowly win these states. And that's the fear that I see, that also with the big sort of liberals are moving away from red states, more into blue states. Conservatives are moving away from blue states into red states. Between the youth being distributed unequally and the sorting, I see a path. It doesn't mean that the Democrats can't win, but I think there is a risk of them being complacent here. And I really worry about that they're not paying attention to this. So those are some of my thoughts about some of the narratives we're hearing about this election, kind of maybe questioning or pushing back on some of them, being a devil's advocate. I think a lot of the conclusions being made are really oversimplified. I think the results here were a lot more nuanced than people are admitting. And I think there's really a jump to conclusions here that's not completely warranted. And I worry that the Democrats are not going to look closely at this. They're going to take this as a sign, as Joe Biden. I mean, somebody asked Joe Biden at a press conference, "What are you going to do differently?" And he said, "Nothing." That's not gonna cut it. That's the wrong attitude to take. That's saying we can just keep on carrying on exactly the direction we're going and just rely on demographics and cross our fingers. That is not how you fight fascism. And it's just not going to work, I don't think, in the long run. So anyway, I hope this was maybe interesting, thought-provoking video. And I'll talk to you later.